Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started here in a minute or two, and we're actually going to try out a new poll option that they have on the webinar. So while you're waiting for it to start, you have a poll that should pop up on your screen that asks how you feel about the new county executive and the county council, and you have options ranging from optimistic to pessimistic. So while we're waiting to start, we'll go ahead and pop that poll up there, and you guys can go ahead and vote. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to close the poll, and we will let you guys know the results in just a minute. So again, good afternoon and welcome to the Chamber Chat. My name is Tricia Swanson. I'm Vice President, Government Relations here at the Council. Oh, hold on one second. It's not showing the, hold on. Okay, there we go. And I'm here with Ashlie Bagwell, Senior Government Relations Associate for Harris, Jones, and Malone, and the Chamber's County Lobbyist. And I wanted to thank all of you for tuning in to the 411 on the County Executive and the County Council. Ashlie and I were both at the inauguration ceremony and the inaugural ball on Monday. I know we saw a lot of you, and the council session yesterday. So we have a bunch of information and fun tidbits to share with you this afternoon. And in looking at the poll, we are split between cautiously optimistic and not sure yet. And then a few people are somewhat pessimistic, but I think Ashlie and I share the cautiously optimistic tone moving forward. Okay, so the agenda today, we're going to be discussing county executive appointments we know so far, information about the new county council, their staff, committee assignments, and issues we see on the horizon with both the county executive and the county council. And then we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A, but do feel free to ask questions throughout the webinar. When you type in the question option, we will actually see it and it'll pop up. So feel free to ask questions throughout as they kind of come up. So we're going to go and dive right in, and we do have another poll for you to do. When we're looking at appointments to various positions, we would really like to know what department you and your team engage with the most. So you'll see a couple of different options, and we will go back to the slide with everyone's names on it once the poll is done. But while you're filling that out, we do know of 2 appointments that are going to be brand new to County Executive Elrich's administration. A lot of you have seen the name Andrew Klein. He is being appointed as the Chief Administrative Officer. He's new to Montgomery County government, although he's been a resident of Montgomery County for a good number of years. And the name Rich Madalino should be fairly known to a lot of you. He is former senator. He stepped down and ran for governor this last year. He previously, before being a senator, worked in the Doug Duncan administration in intergovernmental relations. And really focused on the budget. He's being appointed to the budget director, and so he will be new to the administration, but by no means new to county government or new to budgetary issues. So I think he's a great appointment.
And I think it's worth noting too that Andrew Klein, again, the Chief Administrative Officer, comes from government as well. He was previously with Baltimore City.
Absolutely. And then yesterday, there was a press release put out yesterday by the new county executive as to 8 appointments that, excuse me, he will be keeping from the Leggett administration. Bob Dorfman from Liquor Control, Alex Espinoza from Finance, Eric Friedman from Consumer Protection are all staying on. The 3 public safety heads are staying. Scott Goldstein with Fire and Rescue, Robert Green with Correction and Rehab, and Tom Manger with Police. Al Rashdi is also an individual I know a lot of our members work with, and he's staying on Transportation. And Mel Wanger is staying with intergovernmental relations. And from an advocacy standpoint, I can tell you I'm personally very happy that she's staying on as well. And ones that we're still watching, if we look at the poll results, we're actually fairly split across between the 5 options that we gave. Looks like the highest responses were DPS, DEP, and HHS, but these are all ones that we're definitely still watching. And it's interesting to know who all of you work with. And I know Ashlie had a couple of insights into some of these appointments.
Yeah, as Tricia said, there are still some outstanding appointments, of course, and maybe some of you have heard some rumors or some names flying around as well. Just a couple that I will share. And again, these are just rumors that I have heard and not at all confirmed. But with regard to procurement, I've heard the name Ash Shetty. Some of you may recognize the last name. Ash is the husband of Emily Shetty, who was recently elected to the House of Delegates from District 18. I have heard just those who have mentioned his name have noted that he doesn't have any ties to anyone, and that might be the appeal for the county executive for someone like him. Also, with regard to Health and Human Services, a name that I've heard a couple of times is Kate Garvey, who is someone, too, who's not new to Montgomery County government.
I also see on here we have someone also interested in DGS, and I don't know if we've seen anything about that yet, but that's definitely something that we'll add to our list in terms of things that we're watching, because that's an obviously very important department also. All right, so let's move over to the county council. Here is the brand new county council, and it's kind of hard to see, there's small font, but we put all of their chiefs of staff under their pictures, and we're going to go through each one, and there's also some interesting staff under the chief of staff role that we'll talk about as well. Starting with President Nancy Navarro. She has a new chief of staff, Ikede Roland Ikialoa, who my former boss at the school board was chief of staff to the Board of Education for over a decade. So he brings that perspective with him to President Navarro's office. So that should be interesting. In looking at Vice President Sidney Katz, he is keeping on Lisa. I know a lot of us work with Lisa, and she's wonderful to work with in a very accessible and approachable office. And moving to a new member, Gabe Albornoz, he's at large. He is actually putting Joy Nurmi as his chief of staff, which should be a familiar name to some of you, as she was special advisor to Ike Leggett. So she brings a wealth of knowledge with her to that new member office, which I think was a smart move on Gabe's part. Another new member, Andrew Friedson from District 1, he replaced Roger Berliner, and he actually is keeping Berliner's chief of staff, Cindy Gibson, as his chief of staff.
I think also worth noting, Andrew Friedson is also keeping Aaron Kraut on his staff. Aaron, just based on who's on the phone, might be someone that a lot of you have worked with before. So he will have some continuity in that office from the previous office.
And then Evan Glass, a new at-large member. He appointed Valeria Carranza. She brings a wealth of federal background. She worked on the Hill, and she's bringing that background. And I believe she also worked for Hans Riemer as deputy chief of staff for an amount of time. So she has a lot of federal background, but then also some county background. And then another familiar name in that office will be Pete Tomeo.
Right.
Who I think is a good addition to that office as well.
And he will handle all of the perhaps not surprisingly, will handle a lot of the transportation stuff for Evan.
Yeah, and then moving to Tom Hucker, his office remains unchanged. Dave Coons will remain as his chief of staff.
Tom did somewhat recently add Sean Emerson to his staff, and Sean It sounds like everybody's hiring new transportation people, but Sean will handle all of the transportation issues in Tom's office, and some of you may recognize his name. Sean comes to Tom's office from Delegate Mark Corman's office.
And then the last new member, Will Juwando at large, he has placed Cecily Thorne. She was his campaign manager. She's moving into his chief of staff role.
She comes to him from Capitol Hill. She has extensive federal experience, and if memory serves me correctly, I think immediately before serving as his chief of staff, she worked for a Congress member from Delaware.
And Councilmember Craig Rice's office remains unchanged. Steve Goldstein will still be leading as his chief of staff. And the same with Hans Reamer, keeping on Ken Silverman as his chief of staff.
Hans did add Teddy Osias from Councilmember Nancy Floring's office, so she's going to stay on there.
And that does remind me, those of you that worked with Walt in Councilmember Leventhal's office, Walt has gone to Will Juwando's office. And we have one final poll, which we thought would be interesting to see, and I'm going to go ahead and launch that now on your screens. Which new council member are you most looking forward to working with? We have Gabe Albornoz, Andrew Friedson, Evan Glass, and Will Juwando. And I think we have potential with all of them, but I just wanted to see what all of you, where the votes were with all of you. We're going to give it a couple more seconds. People are still voting. We're neck and neck between two of them.
I feel like we need music.
We do. Okay, I think everyone who's able to has voted. And we actually have a tie between Gabe Albornoz and Andrew Friedson. And then Will Juwando and Evan Glass closing it out. But I think we echo those sentiments, although I think there's potential with all of them. And we're looking forward to working with all of them. And on that vein, and working with them, they announced the County Council committee assignments, which is now up on your screen. And I think we could just high level go through each one. First, Fed, which is where a lot of us begin our work with the County Council. Hans Reamer has been moved to chair of that committee, and Andrew Friedson and Will Juwando will be joining him on that committee. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, it's interesting. Craig Rice will stay the chair of education. It's interesting to note that now that committee is the Education and Culture Committee. Again, with Craig as chair and Nancy Navarro and Will Juwando as members.
HHS is interesting. Gabe Albornoz, the only new member to be chairing a committee, will chair HHS, and he'll be joined by Evan Glass, and Craig Rice will be staying on that committee. But I think that will be an interesting chairmanship there. Public Safety, Vice President Sidney Katz will be chairing that. We'll be joined by Gabe Albornoz and Tom Hucker. Go Committee, Nancy Navarro is staying chair, and Andrew Friedson and Sidney Katz will be joining her. And finally, Tom Hucker will be chair of Transportation and Environment, and he will be joined by Evan Glass and Hans Reamer. All right, so let's talk about issues that we see on the horizon. We broke these out into the county executive and the county council, but as all of you know, there's a lot of overlap. These are just kind of pulled from things that we've heard or things that we picked up over the campaign trail. First thing I have under here under county executive is shift to a 2-year budget cycle, and this kind of ties in with restructuring government also, which is the second bullet point, but we've heard both County Executive Elrich and a few different county council members kind of want to move towards this 2-year budget cycle with the idea of having more time for oversight into whether programs that they're putting money into are delivering and are efficient and working. And it gives them more chance to kind of reflect on it versus jumping from one budget to the next budget. And talking to some people from the community, I think there's some hesitation in various departments to kind of do that. And I don't know what a shift like that would look like, if they would start with some agencies or kind of all in one. I'm not sure, but it's something that we'll be following. I think there's an appetite for both with the county executive and some of the county council. So I think it would be a conversation.
I think it is important, and I've had conversations with some folks about this as well. It's important, I think, to think, when shifting to something like this, what some potential unintended consequences might be. And so for those of you on the phone who are interested in the budget from a professional standpoint, it might be worth giving some thought to how you currently work with the budget and interact with the budget, and are there some upsides and downsides to moving to a 2-year budget cycle, and then how can we help y'all communicate that, especially if there are potential unintended consequences. I think it would be important to perhaps soon communicate those to the county executive and his office as they begin to think about this.
Absolutely. And one thing that we heard talked about a lot on the campaign trail by Mark Elrich is this restructuring government and more efficient government. And I think we're still learning exactly what that means, but something to kind of keep an eye out for that in terms of efficiencies and moving people around or downsizing. We're not quite sure what that's going to look like. Another thing that we heard more towards the end of the campaign trail, but was this idea of benchmarking. The county executive also talked about it in his inaugural speech, that he heard all the time on the campaign trail that Montgomery County is the worst place to do business in terms of our business climate and various taxes and things like that. And so he has already begun to kind of research where we differ from surrounding jurisdictions and really benchmark those and work towards, I think he said in his inaugural speech, not being the worst, and he would be okay with average. So the more that we can share, and we had initial conversations with some of you on the phone about, especially those that work in other jurisdictions, if you know of some areas that Montgomery County is unnecessarily duplicative or longer than other counties, those are things that we want to hear about. And I know that we can, either you can share them with the county executive or we can facilitate that conversation. But I think that's a real opportunity for us to have substantive conversations with him to say, hey, this takes X amount of time in Howard County or Fairfax, and it takes twice as long in Montgomery County. Those are the kind of ideas that we're looking to work with and build on and really bring to him to get some changes.
And this is another issue, I think, where we've seen a lot of interest from council members as well. And certainly some of the new incoming council members have expressed an interest in this as well. And so I think, as we think of these things and have ideas, I think it's something definitely that we can share with the county executive's office, but it's worth talking to council members about as well.
Absolutely. And then another thing that we heard on the campaign trail, and this is one that definitely is between the county executive and the county council, is early childhood education. I don't think that that's a surprise to anyone in looking at expanding pre-K to 4-year-olds and maybe 3-year-olds down the line. But I think what the question has been is, how is this paid for? And the dynamic between the state and the county in terms of how it's paid for and kind of guidance on that.
I mean, this is something definitely that County Executive Elrich brought up in his speech on Inauguration Day, but he takes every opportunity he can to speak about this. As Tricia said, this is something that also comes up with the council, and for those of you who heard Nancy Navarro speak on Tuesday, this is something that she brought up as well. And I can certainly say in conversations that I've had with the county executive and with some of the council members, they have all mentioned the need for a dedicated funding stream. And so I think, the devil's in the details, of course. And so the million-dollar question is, where do they get the money for that dedicated funding stream? Because it's a pretty big price tag. So I think that's something that we're going to be paying very close attention to. I know last year there were rumors, and some of you on the phone may be well aware of this, but there were rumors earlier this year and last year about the possibility of a sugared beverage tax or a soda tax, with the revenue raised from that going towards paying for expanding access to pre-K in the county. I have not, as of late, heard anybody talking about that, and there's one council member in particular who specifically noted that that would not be the dedicated funding stream for something like this. I don't think we can altogether take it off the table just because once something's on the table, it's on the table. But that's certainly been one thing that's been bantied about, but we are definitely going to keep our ears to the ground as these conversations continue.
And then moving to the county council, and Ashlie touched on this, but yesterday, Navarro kind of gave an overview in her, after she was appointed president, she gave an overview on a variety of different topics that I thought it would be interesting to hear about. And Ashlie has notes about the points that she made, but she mentioned a lot of different topics that I thought would be of interest to everybody tuning in.
Yes, she hit on a couple of, or a few interesting things, some not so new, but some kind of interesting and new. The first thing that she mentioned, and this is something too that Mark mentioned in his remarks on Monday, but this concept of looking at things through an equity lens. It's the first thing that she mentioned yesterday, and I think she didn't really expand upon that too much, but I think it will be definitely interesting moving forward to see what that means for policy in the county. But it's definitely something that both the county executive's office has mentioned and the council as well. She did mention, I'm looking at my notes, that there would be equity training in January, I think, for the council, and that somehow or another following that training there would be some sort of community engagement. I'm not entirely sure what any of this means practically speaking, but I think it's something that we will definitely want to watch unfold. She, of course, as Tricia mentioned, closing the opportunity gap and addressing that through early care and education. I think we've already talked about that a good bit. One thing that I thought was interesting, only because it's something that I'd not heard Nancy Navarro speak directly about before, at least in length. And one of the things that she mentioned was implementing a senior agenda, and that the council and the county must prioritize needs of seniors. She talked about redevelopment and revitalization and the need to expand the tax base. I'll also add to that, it was a separate point, but I can say the same thing about both of them. She talked about making the county friendly for business. She specifically mentioned small, medium, and large business. But with regard to those two items, she touched on a few things that the council had done previously, but didn't really lay out anything moving forward. The last thing I'll mention, and I hope I don't steal Tricia's thunder when I do this, but she talked about civic engagement and encouraging participation in the process, just generally speaking. But along those lines, and I think this is something that Hans announced before he stepped down as council president, moving forward, they are going to start identifying a hashtag for each bill that's introduced as a way to further engage the public and encourage participation. And this is kind of an interesting concept. Tricia and I had this conversation a little earlier, but it's definitely a way to encourage participation in terms of the legislative process, and I think one that we need to be on top of as a business community, because perception is important, and we always have conversations about public hearings and being present at public hearings, but this kind of expands, I think, the opportunity for perception to skew one way or the other. And so I think from a social media standpoint, it's a conversation for us worth having as a business community and as a chamber on how we're going to engage there as well.
And to Ashley's point, I think, and the reason we put this in here is when Councilmember Reimber announced it, I think the inclination was to kind of chuckle and say, oh, okay, that's great. And then as we started to think about it, an example that I immediately thought of at the state level, which some of you may be familiar with, was the argument around rain tax. In regard, not getting into the politics of it, but stormwater remediation fee is not as fun of a hashtag as rain tax is. And so, and by calling it rain tax, it completely shifted the narrative around the conversations that advocates on either side were having about the legislation. And so the inclination, I think, was to immediately kind of laugh at this hashtag. But when you look at, for example, Fight for 15, I mean, it's going to change the way potentially that advocates on either side of an issue approach the topic based on the hashtags. So we're going to try and figure out how those hashtags are created. If it's the person that's introducing the bill comes up with the hashtag, would be just an interesting conversation and one that we're going to be following. But we did include that on there just because it was something that people initially kind of laughed at, but then thinking about it more, we just want to focus in on that a little bit. And then the only thing we briefly wanted to mention under the council, because it was unfinished business that we know of, is the cell towers. And I'll let Ashlie touch on that.
Yeah, some of you may remember that the small cell issue was a big one in the fall that did not get resolved, at least from a residential standpoint. And so that issue, we think, is certain to come up in the upcoming year. I think right now we just don't know how or when.
Yeah. And then we did want to briefly touch on, yesterday was their first kind of full day at the council, and there were just some interesting takeaways in terms of the politics and the questions people asked. They had a long discussion on state legislation, and while we won't go into the specifics about any of the bills, it was interesting to see where people were posturing themselves in terms of the questions they were asking and issues that they were immediately getting behind or pushing for. And I think one thing that Ashlie and I have talked about as a high level is that there was kind of a division made between the members that are returning and the new members. And there was multiple comments made by returning members in a joking way, in a lighthearted way, but a way that's like, people come in and think they're going to change the world in the first year, and there's a lot to learn about process and politics, and you come in bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and that might not be the way that you feel moving forward. So there was an interesting kind of division there.
There was a definite, there were some definite subtle and then not so subtle comments, as Tricia said. Several of them kind of urging incoming council members, new council members, to take some time to listen and learn. Which was interesting. And
to talk about specific council members, one thing that immediately jumped out at me in watching the questions they asked, and I don't want to call him out directly, but the new council member, Evan Glass, the questions he asked, it was very apparent to me that he did have a background as a journalist. And the questions that he asked, he had clearly done a lot of research about the multiple issues that they were talking about, just in the way that he approached the questions, having information in front of him about it, doing information outside of what was presented to them. So I just think that's good for all of you to know when you're working with, at least him specifically, that he does a lot of background research on particular issues and comes to the table ready to talk about issues and debate issues and wants to understand both sides of issues. So just keep that in mind as you're working with him moving forward. And then was also Councilmember Craig Rice talked on two different occasions about, and on unrelated bills, but the need to listen to and protect the business community in Montgomery County. And he made specific mention of that on two different occasions. So just something to have in the back of your head as well. Did you have any other?
I think those were my takeaways as well. I will note, just in retouching on the benchmarking issue, because I think several folks have been wondering, this is something that both the council is interested in, definitely the county executive, and once they identify changes that need to be made, how will they be made? And I think certainly it's the county executive's intention, obviously if legislation needs to be passed to make a change, legislation will be passed. But I think much of that could probably be done from a regulatory standpoint, or even from just changing internal processes. I had a conversation with the new county executive once simply about, how departments get information from one place to another, literally. So it could be, they make a change from literally mailing information from one office to another to sending it electronically. I mean, I think some of the changes are as simple and base as that.
And related to that, the chamber was asked to serve on the transition team, which was incredibly informative. And the biggest theme that came out of the economy work group on the transition team was this culture of yes, which doesn't happen through legislation or regulation, but just the idea that it has to come from the county executive and trickle down to the departments that, yes, we are open for business. Yes, we want businesses here. And if you're an inspector and you have a particular issue, working with the business to say, this is how to fix it versus saying, no, that's wrong. And just really this culture of yes that I think the Leggett administration tried to do and didn't go as far as some of our businesses would like. But that was the overarching theme of the transition team, was this culture of yes and having a business climate that welcomes businesses and actively seeks out business, and not an attitude of, oh, you want to open a business in Montgomery County, good luck. And that has to come from the county executive down, and that can't be through legislation or regulation. It has to be an attitude that County Executive Elrich starts with now and continues throughout his tenure. So we'll go to Q&A, and we did have a couple questions already. Just some quick answers. The county executive and the council members serve 4 years. Their term is 4 years. It's in line with the state, and so they'll be up again for election in 4 years. And yes, I will be sending out the presentation. We'll make it available online, but we can also I can also email it out to all of you after this, and the recording will be available, and we can send that out to all of you as well. But now moving into the particular questions, we had one about the Fed committee specifically, and how Hans Reamer's chair, but there's also 2 brand new members. And we can talk a little bit about that. From my perspective, I think it's interesting to look at the approaches that I think Friedson and Jawanda will take. When we were meeting with Jawanda, I think he'll be approaching this committee from a workforce standpoint versus a business background standpoint. And so kind of marrying the two, I think, is going to be an interesting perspective that we'll have to work through.
And just stating the obvious, because 2 of them are new, I think educating them is going to be incredibly important. I think the good thing, just looking at Friedson's office, because he's still got Aaron Kraut there, and so from a staffing standpoint, I think that continuity will be important, both with Cindy and Aaron. But I think it's going to be really important to take time to educate these new members. And I think Tricia's right, to try and anticipate their starting place, I think will be helpful.
The next question I see on here is whether social media posts on legislation will be considered a part of the record.
I think our comment there is that's a good question. I mean, whether it's considered officially on the record, I think as I understood what they said yesterday, they will create a hashtag for every bill introduced, and they are thinking that this is a way to further allow people to participate in the process. But do they intend to, I don't know if they intend to make it an official part of the record so much as yet another way of reaching out to council members and letting them know how you feel about a certain issue one way or another. So, maybe we can look at it as, and see how technologically unsavvy I am, but, you can kind of look at that as yet another way to email a council member. Maybe it's the same as shooting them an email and saying, I don't like this bill for this reason.
Another question relating to committees, since we have that up, was there any discussion based about what topics will be placed under education and culture based on the recently added culture component?
I think one of the things that I've heard with regard to that piece is some of the arts funding stuff, like the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra came up specifically, like those issues that typically have gone to HHS that are more arts and arts focused and arts program related will now be shifted to education again versus HHS where they were before.
Another question we have is how much public input would you expect as a part of the government reform effort? Should the business community be concerned that maybe some, perhaps certain unions might have a more influential seat at the table?
I mean, I think that's a fair question. And, so, I think the last two times that I've heard Mark speak, the most recent being on Monday, he certainly did mention not so much unions, but working with staff on restructuring government, and that county staff knows that this is a direction that the county needs to go in. And so, I think that's worth us giving some thought to. I think worth giving thought and coming up with specific recommendations for participation in this process and then pitching them to the administration versus just saying, we'd like a seat at the table. I think we should pitch something specifically to him.
And to that point, I don't think that much conversations have happened in that area yet. I had a conversation with county executive staff that isn't at a department head level. They said it was maybe 2 rungs below that level, and that the county executive was still having conversation about department heads at this point, and who will fill those roles. And so I think there's time to meet with him and talk to him and about those particular concerns. I don't think they're already decided. I think he is, to Ashley's point, wanting input, and the more that we can do that now versus being reactionary down the line, I think the better position that we're in. And I don't know if there are any other questions, but I think we can go ahead and close out. I did want to thank you all for tuning into the Chamber Chat today. Please do remain involved with us. Our plan moving forward is to host 1 or 2 of these Chamber Chats a month. And we'll be doing similar ones to today. We can also touch on some federal and state issues as they come up, but we also kind of want to know what would be of interest to you, whether particular topics you'd like us to pull experts in on. The idea is to just have these quick and easy while you're eating your lunch, tune in and then go about your day. So if there are particular issues that you would like for us to organize and touch on over the next year, please do reach out to either Ashlie and myself, and we can start planning those. And I will just put in a plug for our next event, the Business Accelerator, next Thursday for 8 to 10 a.m. The topic is Meet the Award Winners and Learn from the Best. Our panelists will include 3 of our winners from the recent Business Awards dinner who will share the secrets of their success with regard to strategic planning, recruitment techniques, staff recognition, etc. This is another great opportunity to network with fellow members. So again, thank you so much. Actually, we had someone that wants us to maybe do a webinar on some of the local bills that we have, and I think that would be interesting because there are a gamut of different topics and policy changes proposed in local legislation. So
that's a good idea, and just I guess just for some information on that, and then we can follow up and see when that makes sense. But as Tricia mentioned, the council, for those of you who don't know, take a position on, or at least speak about every local bill that's been introduced, and take a position on most, if not all of them. They did take up a lot of very complicated, and I would argue some controversial bills yesterday. I think the intention was for them to kind of roll through these bills and take positions, but I think once they realized what was on the list and how complicated and complex they were, they just decided to discuss the bills, and they discussed them for quite some time. But I think they are planning on coming back on January 14th and taking up those bills in addition to additional bills that are added to the list. And, you know, a lot of local bills that get decided on in Annapolis have county impact, of course, and so it's worth paying attention to those.
And then we did have a small question on here. The right person to reach out to schedule a meeting with Mark?
So that's a good question. Up until just before the inauguration, Debbie Spielberg in his office was, and these are two things that we didn't mention, but Debbie Spielberg, who was in Mark's council office, was the person who was handling meeting requests. As I understand, Debbie's not going to do that moving forward permanently. I think she probably still is now, but I've not heard mention of who's going to be doing that for him permanently. So maybe Debbie is a good person to reach out to. I think, just speaking of Mark's administration, Debbie will play a prominent role in his administration. And you know, if you don't mind the analogy, I think I would call Debbie Mark's Joy Nurmi. The other thing worth noting in terms of his administration, as I understand, is that Dale, his chief of staff when he was on the council, obviously is going to be a part of Mark's administration, and as I understand, will fill the role that Bonnie Kirkland had. So he will be the liaison between the administration and the county council.
Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and sign off. We wanted to stay under 45 minutes, and we are right at 43. So thank you all so much for tuning in. If you have any other questions, please feel free to either email me or Ashlie. And like I said, I will email out this PowerPoint for you to have, and we will, when we get the recording, we will place that on our YouTube video and make that available too. And you can feel free to share that with your networks or staff as you feel appropriate. So thank you so much. Everybody have a wonderful holiday if we don't talk to you before then. And we will, I'm sure, talk to all of you soon.
Bye, everybody.